Meanwhile, going from politics to the economy, as if you can separate the two, new claims for U.S. unemployment benefits rose unexpectedly last week. Now, government officials are dismissing this rise, blaming it on the Easter holiday. Meanwhile, though, home foreclosures have jumped to their highest rate in 5 years. Here to help us make sense of this latest U.S. financial news is Gerald Celente. He's director of Trends Research Institute. Thanks for joining us. Now, Mr. Celente, 24,000 more initial jobless claims were filed last week. They totaled 484,000. Analysts were actually expecting a drop. Now, the Labor Department saying this volatility is always associated with the Easter holiday, and the rise is about administrative factors and not really layoffs. Now, I want to know, what does Easter have to do with jobless claims?
Very little, and they try to use any excuse they can to cover up the damage that really exists. Let's look at where the job creation is really happening. Of course, there is job growth. The situation now is much better than it was a year ago. But why? Because they've dumped trillions of dollars into the system. That's why the stock market's on a rise. That's why the unemployment numbers look better. And where is the unemployment, the new employment coming from? Well, we know census workers, healthcare workers, temporary jobs, a little blip up in manufacturing. But by and large, the nation's job creation is for cashiers, clerks, healthcare workers, shelf stockers, and other civil servants. So that's where the creation is.
So you don't buy the Easter holiday as an excuse, it sounds like. And meanwhile, a new report shows that, let's talk about housing, for the first 3 months of this year, 1 in every 138 homes received a foreclosure notice. This is a 35% increase over the same period last year. There's 1 million repossessions expected this year. What does this all indicate about the state and direction of the economy? I mean, it certainly doesn't sound like the housing market's getting any better.
Well, nothing is getting much better other than the money that went to the top of the system, the bailouts for the too big to fails. They're making it appear as though there's a recovery, and the other money, of course, being dumped back into the system via the stimulus. But as you point out, the foreclosures tell the real story, and they're only going to get worse. So how is this going to turn around? It's not, because also the housing market only looks as good as it does now. It's again because the Federal Reserve had dumped in what? Well over almost $1.5 trillion. Where are the home loans being made through? FHA, who's backing them? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And now all that's unwinding. Plus, at the end of April, they're going to do away with the tax credit that boosted home sales. So, no, we've said this over and over again. This is not a recovery. It's merely a cover-up. And the stimulus is going to run out. The cover-up's coming off, and we're heading toward much worse times ahead.
Okay, so you're down on housing, you're down on jobs. Let's talk about financial reform. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner is pushing for reforms of the derivatives financial markets. He's repeating what the Obama administration's position is, despite resistance from financial lobbyists. But, I've seen him in hearings before discourage bank regulation. He's ignoring one top committee chair's idea to force banks to spin off their swap desks. So help me kind of make sense of this. What do you make of the financial reform plan in regard to credit swaps, and would this reform even address the problem?
No, it doesn't address the problem. We have to, as we see it, reinstitute much more aggressive legislation, such as the Glass-Steagall Act, which they repealed, that would have prevented a lot of this from happening. And it's just a lot of talk about reform. What are they talking about? For example, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Federal Reserve System being the watchdog over for consumer fraud. I mean, that's like putting Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly in charge of law enforcement. Who are these people kidding? There's no reform going out there.
Really quickly, because you mentioned we're almost out of time, but quickly tell us what Glass-Steagall is, because that's a really interesting point that you made.
Yeah, well, what happened was after the Great Depression, they put into banking regulations that prohibited banks from becoming investment banks. Essentially, investment bank is white shoe boy language for casinos that gamble. And banks were very boring up until they repealed those acts, and it came under the Clinton administration and excelled under the Bush administration. And they allowed this whole this whole sham of derivatives, credit default swaps, auction rate securities. You know, these are just games played to gamble, and the people have to bail out the losers. So we really need the kind of legislation they put into place that prevented this from happening in the first place, and they're not going to do that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. You certainly don't hear a lot of politicians talking about Glass-Steagall. I want to thank you for bringing that up and for talking to us about this latest news.